We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked.
And complete the dang fence.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill.
Cast down your bucket where you are.
We come from France.
And I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants.
They're coming in by the thousands, just unbelievable.
A wall is an immorality.
Who are you rooting for? Those masters of the universe are at it again.
You maniac! You blew it up!
Welcome to Parsing Immigration Policy, the podcast of the Center for Immigration Studies. My name is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center. There's been a lot of talk this election season about the effects that immigrants have on our political system. A lot of it is focused on the issue of whether immigrants, non-citizens rather, in general, or even illegal immigrants specifically, are voting. And personally, I'm skeptical that there's a big effect there, but we're going to talk about that a little more. But immigrants have a significant effect on our political system just by their presence here because, and the basic insight is that they're counted as people. And so they're factored into all the various issues of representation, whether it's in the House of Representatives or even in state legislatures. And so we released a couple of new studies on this, and we have in the studio the author or co-author of those, Stephen Camerata, a director of research here at the Center, who's written about these issues in the past, but obviously with the enormous level of immigration we've seen under the Biden-Harris administration, this changes things somewhat. And so, Steve, thanks for coming in. And if we could just sort of get basic kind of groundwork of what is it we're talking about? Why do immigrants, even if they don't vote, have an effect on our political system?
Right, Mark. Well, thanks for having me today. We have, as you said, 3 studies out. One looks at the size of the non-citizen population, and if they voted, where might they have an impact? Now, the other 2 directly address this question of how their inclusion in the census impacts political representation. We know from a variety of sources that immigrants, including illegal immigrants, do respond to the census. There were over 20 million non-citizens, say, in the last census in 2020, although there were problems with that census. And in addition to that, there were probably at least 10 million, or roughly speaking, 10 million illegal immigrants who responded to the 2020 census. Very briefly, we know that because we know how many legal immigrants there should be, and we know from a variety of methods that there's a lot of people responding to the census that are illegal immigrants. So non-citizens generally and illegal immigrants in particular are included in the census in large numbers. Some get missed, but the ones that do get counted have an effect. Because remember, seats are apportioned, that is distributed to the states based solely on total population, not citizens, not adults, not people of voting age or anything like that. It's just population totals. And in addition to that, when districts are drawn within states, it's based entirely on total population, not citizenship, not adult population, voting age, or anything like that. So it's not based on anything other than total population when each state gets its votes in the U.S. House of Representatives and within the states when the district lines are drawn. And one other place that has an impact, obviously, is in the Electoral College, because the Electoral College is based on the size of your congressional delegation as well. So the inclusion of immigrants, bottom line, is going to have an impact on seats in the U.S. House of Representatives and votes in the Electoral College.
And the basic assumption there, or the reason that's true, is because each district is supposed to have roughly the same number of people. It'll never be exact for complicated reasons, but it's close. And so, a state with lots of immigrants each district has to have whatever it is now, 600,000 or 700,000 or more people in it, roughly speaking. And depending on what state you're in, a lot of those people could be immigrants, or maybe very few of them are immigrants.
That's right. So the other point to keep in mind is their inclusion means that they're going to have an effect, and their numbers are very large, right? In the most recent data, we have, 50 million plus immigrants in the United States. That is foreign born. legal, illegal, naturalized citizens, and what have you. And in addition, they're not evenly spread across the country, which also has important implications. They are heavily concentrated in relatively few states, though immigrants are certainly in every state. And in addition to that, within states, they tend to be heavily concentrated in relatively few, say, urban areas. And so that also has implications. Large size, coupled with their inclusion in the data and their uneven distribution, is why they matter so much to this discussion.
So I don't want to go through all of these numbers. We'll have the links in the show notes, and it'll be on our homepage as well to look at the reports and get the details. But sort of at top line level, in the 2020 census, how many seats did the presence of immigrants shift overall, and then a little bit of detail?
Right. So if we just look at the immigrants themselves, and again, that's legal and illegal who are likely included in the census, we get 17 seats being affected, being redistributed among the states.
Now, what's that mean?
That means a state like California generally gained a whole bunch of seats, and a number of other states typically lost 1 or 2 seats, or maybe the better way to put it, had 1 or 2 seats less
than they would have had otherwise. Right. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So, and again, I don't want to sort of overwhelm people with detail, but which are the states that did the best out of the presence of immigrants in the 2020 census?
Right. So as you might suspect, the big winners, we did several simulations, and I won't go through them, but just, if we did 2020, then we did what would happen if the census was taken now and tried to incorporate this massive surge we've seen, and then we projected all the way out to 2030. Bottom line, the big winners are going to be the states that you think of: California, New York, New Jersey, maybe Illinois, these states, and as well as Texas and Florida. They're the Republican states. And generally speaking, the states that lose the most, though they can be spread out throughout the country as well, are states like Ohio. Large populations, so they have a lot of representatives to lose, and they don't have that many immigrants. And so the Midwest it's often battleground states in the Midwest. A state like Wisconsin, a state like Michigan, in our various simulations often lose 1 or 2. But Ohio tends, because it's big and has few immigrants, is really a state that tends to lose the most from immigration, but other states as well. So it'll always generally be states with small immigrant populations, though sometimes a state with a moderate-sized immigrant population could still lose because of immigration, because they're right on the cusp one way or the other. And the inclusion of immigrants in other states will cause them to actually lose their seats. So it's always complicated the way it plays out. Just a brief explanation about methodology. What you do is you take the apportionment population, that is everyone who's here at these various time periods, and then you begin to subtract populations and recalculate what apportionment looks like. And that's how you can see what the impact of say, immigrants are, or if you want to focus just on illegal immigrants and that sort of thing.
And one of the reasons for this is that not only are districts supposed to be roughly equal in number of people in them, citizens, non-citizens, immigrants, whatever, but there's also a fixed number of seats in the House of Representatives. That's by statute at 435, so that conceivably the effect would still exist, but I mean, maybe I'm thinking of the math wrong, but would be attenuated if you just added more seats?
It could. I mean, we use a system called equal proportions, but the bottom line is no, if you added 100 seats, it would still be the case that whatever share of the total population immigrants are, they would still have that effect.
Right.
So instead of California gaining 7 seats because of the presence of immigrants, if you doubled the House of Representatives, maybe it would gain 14. And instead of Ohio losing 2 seats, it would then lose 4.
Right.
You see what I mean? Because the congressional delegations would be so much bigger. So adding seats can, and this is what Congress did in the past until we decided after really 1920, we're not going to add any more seats. But what happened was they just kept adding seats, so at least states didn't lose. And so the loss of political power was not so apparent, not so abrupt. And you could see why they would do that. But the other states were still gaining a whole lot. So adding seats would make a slight difference at the margins of about who wins and who loses. But no, it wouldn't change the underlying mathematics.
Right. Interesting. And so you ran these various simulations, but one of the things you also ran was immigrants and the minor children of immigrants living at home, because obviously most people have some immigrant ancestor, but that's not really policy relevant. The issue is households headed by immigrants. And so what was the effect? How much bigger was it if you included the U.S. born little kids who live in immigrant households?
Right. So if you do the 2020 scenario, it's 17 seats move around because of the inclusion of immigrants in the census. And if we put in their minor children, it comes up to 22 seats. So the effects gets bigger. If we project it all the way out to 2030, we get 22 seats just for the immigrants and 28 seats when we include the minor children. So this reminds us of really just how big the impact of immigration is on the United States.
Really, yeah. And an important point is this is not the effect of new immigrants that came, say, between 2020 and 2030. This is just the total immigrant population could have been people who came in 1960 or something like that.
Right. No, that's exactly right. This is not the impact since the last census. This is just the impact of their presence here now. If you run simulations saying, what would happen if they were here and if they weren't?
Right. So one thing that, as I said before, that has agitated and concerned a lot of people is the effect of illegal immigrants on our political system. And in this context about their being counted, like you said, illegal immigrants, some share of them are counted by the census, probably most of them. I mean, maybe I'm wrong on that, but I suspect probably most of them. How big is the effect, though, in this issue of redistributing House seats and electoral votes?
It's an effect. It's not trivial, but it's nowhere near as big as immigration overall. And remember here, we're only trying to estimate how many illegal immigrants are counted in the census. If they're not counted in the census, they don't really matter for apportionment and redistricting. So there could be a lot more in the United States, and that could matter for many things. But for apportionment and redistricting, it only matters if they're counted in the census. So to give you some idea, although in 2020 we estimate 17 seats changed hands due to the inclusion of all immigrants in the survey, it's the case that we think that illegal immigrants only are basically 2 of those seats. If we look at add in the minor children of immigrants, we get 3 seats. Now, this grows over time, so let's be clear. And if you project out the current growth in the number of illegal immigrants included in census data or likely to be included, by 2030, it's 7 seats will be potentially affected. And then if you count the children, it will be 9 seats. So certainly not nothing, and it certainly will matter to the states that lose. But the much larger impact is from immigration overall, or legal immigrants in particular, simply because in terms of the census anyway, they're so much more numerous.
Right, right. Now, one of the reactions to the critiques of immigration, in other words, immigration has these various effects, on fiscal policy, et cetera. One of the reactions often is, well, just leave immigration alone and fix whatever the other policy is, which is, I have my own concerns. It's not really very realistic. But in this context, could you just only count citizens? Why can't you just do that and just not worry about non-citizens or illegal immigrants specifically by only counting citizens when you decide how many congressmen each state gets?
Right. Well, the reason we can do this is the Census Bureau, not in the decennial census, but in other surveys, asks about citizenship. And this can give us a very good sense of what's going on between states and how many non-citizens or immigrants generally, or even illegal immigrants are included in Census Bureau data. But if you wanted to actually exclude non-citizens, you'd have to ask that question at the very least on the census every 10 years, which we don't do. The Trump administration actually did try to do that prior to the 2020 election, but the Supreme Court said, you can't add it because you're not really telling us the real reason why you want to add it. See, it was to my mind, a crazy decision, or a decision that's very difficult to understand, but that was the argument they used. So,
especially since in earlier censuses, they had asked the citizens. It's
Right.
been asked on and off kind of sporadically. We, in fact, we did a table on that about which censuses they asked about citizenship and which they didn't. And there's no consistent pattern.
Right. So basically, in 1820, they asked some limited stuff. And then from 1850 to really 1950, they asked in every census about citizenship and other questions like birthplace of parents or at least birthplace of the immigrant themselves, what country. And then after 1950, they had this other system where they called it like the long form, where a subset of people were always asked, a representative subset. And then that ended, however, in the 2000 census. But after 2000, we have this other survey called the American Community Survey. We also have another survey called the Current Population Survey. So we have a pretty good sense of how many immigrants there are, how many non-citizens there are, and so forth. But you would have to re-ask it. And the court has said you can ask it, but they didn't like the way the Trump administration went about it. So there's that. Now, on the question of whether you can apportion between the states the seats based on only citizenship, say, that seems very hard. The way the Constitution reads, without going into detail, it would seem to most people, and it's usually been interpreted, that you have to count everyone, all the people.
The whole number of persons,
right.
I think, is the
However,
language.
the courts have only said on redistricting within states, once the seats are given out to each state, that a state may draw them by total population. But it hasn't said that you must. It's possible that you could use citizenship. Who knows how the courts would rule? So that would be a possibility. So there's the practical question of getting it included on the census. And then there are legal questions. And I don't think we're going to go to a system where when it comes to apportionment, that things are likely to change. It's likely to be the whole population. That's the straightforward mainstream interpretation of the Constitution. Redistricting within states may be another matter, but I'll leave that to constitutional scholars.
And you didn't deal with this in any of these reports because it's a much more complicated issue, though presumably something that can be addressed. But this issue also affects state legislatures, too, because their districts are all drawn based on the national census and also have to be roughly the same size, according to Supreme Court.
No, that's exactly right. So it's certainly not just Congress. So that every political office that isn't sort of an office for the entire community, so not the mayor or maybe not the governor, but if you're looking at anything that has any kind of district, whether it's your state house or your state senate or your local sewer authority, all of these districts are drawn based on total population, and those total population include tens of millions of non-citizens. So the impact is most certainly not simply confined to the House of Representatives and the Electoral College.
You did the big report that we have. Again, these will all be both in the show notes, but they'll also be on our homepage, was on this issue of reapportionment that we've been talking about. But you did a smaller companion report on what I kind of like to describe, even though this is a little bit of an exaggeration, as the issue of rotten boroughs. For those who don't know English history, the Parliament over centuries distributed seats, but there were by district, but there were districts with only 5 people in them or 2 voters or something like that. And they had the same member of Parliament as some district in London that had thousands of people in it. So it was a kind of an imbalance in political power where, 5 voters in what they called a rotten borough had the same voting representation in Parliament as, thousands of people in a different one. In a much less extreme way, immigration does create sort of something like a similar phenomenon here, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Let me see if I can give you an example. So look, if you looked at the 13 congressional districts with the highest share of non-citizens in 2022 at the time of the last election, they have roughly the same population of voting age citizens as the 9 districts with the lowest non-citizen shares. That is, districts made up almost all of citizens. Thus, these 9 high citizen districts have 4 fewer representatives, but for the same number of citizens. So you get a lot of political distortion there. You get these districts that end up having a representative, even though a large share of the population are not American citizens. And of American citizens, at least in the data that we have, about half are legal and half are illegal.
Among immigrants.
Yeah, among non-citizens, not among immigrants.
Yeah.
But it's among non-citizens. So that gives you an idea. Now, look, the other thing to keep in mind is the population of districts can differ partly because of the way the House seats are apportioned between or among the states. But even within the same state, where districts should be roughly even in size, non-citizens still cause significant distortions. So this is just in 2022. Consider the 33rd District of Texas, where 29% of adults are not American citizens. It has 208,000 fewer voting age citizens than the 21st District, where only 4% are not citizens. And again, this is all within Texas, as is the case. So although each one of those districts, of course, gets one representative, despite the fact that there's more than 200,000 fewer citizens in one of those districts. So they're the same in total population, but they don't come close in the population of citizens, and yet each get one representative. So you can see that this does create a certain distortions. And if I could draw that out a little bit more, Mark.
Sure.
So not surprisingly, the non-citizenship share of the voting age population has a huge impact on turnout, right? If there's not a lot of citizens, they're not likely to turn out. In the 10 districts with the largest non-citizen shares, the combined vote total was roughly half that of the combined vote total in the 10 districts with the highest citizen shares. So these 10 districts, twice as many people voted in these high citizenship districts as in the high non-citizen districts. And yet, again, they have exactly the same representation in Congress. In effect, each voter in the 10 low immigrant districts had about twice the influence on the election because it takes so many fewer votes to win in these districts where so many non-citizens live. So that does, in some ways, or can be seen as impacting the principle of one man, one vote.
Right, yeah, because if you live in a high immigration district, you're sort of, I mean, not exactly, but you're kind of one man, two votes in a sense. I mean, not literally, but that's kind of what it amounts to.
Yep.
So, and I want to get just to touch briefly on this issue of voting. If large numbers of non-citizens were voting, this would not be the case, right? Because this turnout thing, if turnout's much lower in districts with lots of non-citizens, that means, or that suggests that there's not that many non-citizens who are actually voting.
Right. If non-citizens were voting in large numbers, we'd expect areas where there's lots of non-citizens to have very high rates of turnout, very high vote totals, and we don't see that. It doesn't mean no non-citizens. That's a double negative, isn't it? It doesn't mean no non-citizens vote. It just means that relatively few must be voting for the pattern overall to look this way. However, one caveat about that, or one point, is in one of our studies looks at how many would have to vote to make a difference.
How many non-citizens?
How many non-citizens would have to vote. And when we look at the state level, and we look at the margins in the last election, because the same states will be close this time as last time, it looks like there's two states in particular, Georgia and Arizona, where if around 2% or a little less than 2% of non-citizens voted, it could equal the margin of victory in the last election. So a relatively small fraction, if they vote, could conceivably, or at least in theory, at least equal the margin in the last election. So in those two states, Georgia and Arizona, it could make a difference. Now, the rest of the country, the non-citizen population may not be large enough, or the race isn't close enough to really expect. You'd have to have a very large fraction of non-citizens voting, and that just does not seem plausible at this point. But it is true that it could make a difference in Georgia and Arizona, even if only a small fraction voted.
Yeah, just to be clear, though, so people don't get too excited about this, the less than 2% of non-citizens voting to make up the margin of victory assumes that every single one of them votes for the Democratic candidate. And if the split were, different, then the percentage that would have to vote of non-citizens to make a difference would have to be even larger than that.
Much larger. So we have some evidence that in the last election, naturalized citizens, not non-citizens, naturalized citizens voted about 2/3 for Joe Biden.
Who can legally vote, obviously.
Yeah, right. So voted for Joe Biden over Trump. If that pattern were holding, in Georgia and Arizona, it would take around 5% of non-citizens to vote for the net gain, if you just subtract what Trump got and what Biden got, for that net increase to be larger than the margin of error. Now, we know of no research or survey data suggesting that naturalized citizens or foreign-born voters are likely to favor the Republican. But, I suppose in some place, or that's possible. But if the previous pattern holds, based on our limited data, it still could happen that the non-citizens decided the race if about 5% voted, and they voted 2/3 Democratic, 1/3 Republican. But again, keep in mind, the fact that it's possible is in no way evidence that it's actually happening. But what it does show is that it wouldn't take much for them to be able to shift a state.
Right. Yeah. I mean, honestly, I'm skeptical that even 2%, let alone 5% of non-citizens would be voting. But your point is valid, is that at least for those two states, it's not completely bananas to imagine it. Whereas you went through other states as well, and the percentages of non-citizens that would have to vote were, totally implausible and, ludicrous. In fact, there's just no way that's true.
I agree.
So, and that's we're going to have a link to that in our site as well. In a sense, what we're talking about is one of the other impacts of immigration that people don't often talk about. I mean, we talk a lot about the economic impact, the fiscal impact, security, what have you. But the point is, there is a real political impact here too. And one of the things you looked at was the differential partisan impact as well. In other words, would it help Democratic leaning states more than Republican ones, or vice versa? What'd you find there?
Yeah. So in general, if we look at the net gain of what Republican versus Democratic states, and here we're going to divide the states based on how they voted in the 2020 election. So we'll look at Republican states, Democratic states, and then the 5 states that flipped between 16 and 2020 as the battlegrounds. Immigrants in 2020 created a net gain of 14 seats in Democratic states. It's not 14 states because a lot of it is California, but at 14 for a net gain of 14 in 2020 for Democratic states, and a net loss of 10 for Republican states in 2020 in terms of, after the apportionment happened. And then there were 4 seats that were lost also by battleground states. So it was, on balance, pretty significant gain of 14 net seats for states.
And what was the time period for this?
This is 2020.
Okay.
Right, after the 2020. We haven't had a reapportionment after 2020.
Right.
So, however, it should be noted that over time, the net gain may well be less because so many immigrants, including illegal immigrants, settle in Florida and Texas. And in our analysis, we are considering them Republican states because they were won both by Donald Trump in 16 and 2020. So it tends to make the partisan impact a little less. But if you look at 2030 and we assume the same pattern of growth we've seen in recent years, it still results in a net gain for Democrats of 10 seats. And so it still looks like Democrats are gaining, but maybe not as much. Now, it's possible Texas and Florida will flip, given how much immigration they have, because, again, as we've talked, naturalized citizens vote about 2-to-1 for Democratic candidates in the past. That, of course, that could change. So, but if you just assume that the same patterns that existed, say, in 2020, what were the battleground states then and now, then it still looks like a gain, though maybe not as much for the Democrats as before, but still significant.
Right. So basically, what I take from this is that immigration does have a significant political effect. It's most likely to be decisive in very close races. But the fact is, it does, in fact, reapportion or redirect political power toward citizens in places where there's lots of immigrants.
Right. That's the way to think about it. The big winners are people who live in high immigrant states and high immigrant areas who are able to vote because the districts are drawn based on population. So in effect, because there's so many people who live around them who can't vote, their vote ends up counting a lot more. And in general, the areas where immigrants settle are Democratic areas, and Democratic states. And so that's why it tends, on balance, to significantly benefit the Democrats. Now, what we haven't talked about is congressional districts and the relationship between non-citizens and the Democratic vote. I'd like to just go over a little of that. Districts where non-citizens comprise a large share of the population, as I say, tend to vote pretty strongly Democratic, while high citizenship districts tend to vote Republican. So let's look at the 24 districts where 1 in 5 adults is not an American citizen. Only 4 of that 24 were won by a Republican in 2022. In contrast, in the 54 states where less than 2% of adults are not citizens, just 5 are represented by a Democrat. So what you see is there are exceptions, but in general, if the district is heavily non-citizen, it's usually represented by a Democrat, and if it's heavily citizen, it's usually represented by a Republican. And so that has implications for representation in Congress. Republicans overall, in terms of the total vote for the House of Representatives, have to win by more to overcome the intrinsic advantage that Democratic voters have in high non-citizen districts. Let me just give you one other statistic. In 2022, each 1 percentage point increase in the non-citizen share of a congressional district's adult population is associated with a 1.8 percentage point increase in the Democratic share of the vote in that district. So in other words, for each 1% increase in non-citizens, the correlation, if you will, is about 1.8 points. Now, you might say, well, that sounds like the non-citizens are all voting Democratic. No, that's not what it means. What it really means is the thing we talked about before. Immigrants tend to go to areas, primarily in cities, which are heavily Democratic. So where they're living tends to be associated with a large fraction of the vote going to Democrats, but it does have the effect of giving Democratic voters in those areas a whole lot of extra voting power. So it really has to do with where the immigrants go. So it's this statistic I just gave you is not evidence of non-citizen voting.
Right. But it's just more, it just reinforces the idea that the presence of immigrants reapportions, distorts political power. The takeaway that I would take from this is that in states that think that immigration is not an issue for them, because they don't have a lot of people that the welfare issue isn't a big deal for them. Schools, it's not that big deal. There aren't that many immigrants, all the other issues. They still have a real stake in this because they're the ones who are basically political power kind of slipping through their fingers because immigrants are going elsewhere in large numbers.
Yeah, and I would add that within a state, especially if there's a lot of immigrants there, if you live in the part of the state where there aren't that many immigrants, again, you might say, well, it's not really affecting me here. But in fact, within the state, because of the way redistricting works, it is affecting you. And again, I could give you a bunch of examples, but there are in Texas, in Florida, in New York, or California, and some other places, New Jersey, districts, mostly all citizens, and districts where a huge fraction of the population are non-citizens, but they each get one representative. And that means that, again, the voters who live around non-citizens have a lot more influence on the political process than you have if you're living in one of these high citizen districts.
Right. Thanks, Steve, for coming in and explaining all of this. Again, this is going to be on our website and it'll be in the show notes. There's several pieces that Steve has done on this issue of how immigration impacts political power and the distribution of political power within the country. And we may learn something from the election results. Some of this isn't really dependent on that directly, but this kind of is a context for how to think about what happens in the election, at least with regard to immigration. And there'll be another census in 2030, and we'll see how much of this is borne out. So anyway, for now, thanks, Steve, for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
And finally today, this will be posted on Thursday, and Election Day will be Tuesday, so in 5 days or whatever that is. And it'll be interesting because we'll see, will there be not just a long-term change in immigration policy, but what will we see at the border right after the election? Because our own Todd Bensman was down in southern Mexico, and he wrote a piece for, I believe it was the Daily Mail, where he quoted a Venezuelan or some immigrant, some non-Mexican migrant down there who wanted to get into the U.S., saying, "We pray Trump doesn't win." So it'll be interesting to see if Trump does win. Will there be a rush for the border to get in before inauguration? If Harris wins, will the Mexican government basically give up its efforts to bottle people up in southern Mexico to make the border numbers look better in order to help her electoral prospects? I don't know what the answer is. I think the numbers are likely to go up after Election Day, regardless of who prevails. But it will be interesting to see, and it will be an indication of how much our political debate actually affects migration, because illegal immigrants follow our politics, especially those who are, prospective illegal immigrants. Let me put it that way. Those who want to come here, they follow the news. They know what the latest pronouncements are from various political candidates and what the likely effect would be of the victory of one over the other. So it'll be interesting to see what happens on November 6th or 7th at the border. Does Mexico just sort of give up its efforts and prove that it was just a transparently political effort to help the Democratic candidate, or what? I have no answer. I don't know. I don't know that anybody else knows, but something's going to happen, and it will be interesting to see in the sense of the old Chinese proverb, "May you live in interesting times," or the Chinese curse. But in the meantime, whoever you're going to vote for, make sure you go out and vote. Tuesday is Election Day, and we will see how the table has been set or changed with regard to immigration policy when we get the results in, hopefully on election night. Hopefully this won't take 2 weeks to find out who wins. In the meantime, this is Mark Krikorian for Center for Immigration Studies. Please rate and review Parsing Immigration Policy if your platform allows that. And whether it does or doesn't, feel free to just send us an email at center@cis.org if you have ideas for future shows, criticisms, compliments, what have you. Thanks for listening. Thanks to our producer, Brian Griffith, and to Steve Camerata, our Director of Research, for explaining these recent reports of his. And I hope to see you on our next episode.